It was supposed to be an ordinary road trip, just another summer drive through the dusty roads of Arizona. But on that hot July afternoon in 1995, David and Marla Blackwell's lives would be shattered by a single, twisted decision. A decision that would send them straight into the heart of a nightmare. They didn't know it yet, but the road ahead would no longer be the highway they knew. The stretch of Highway 95 they had driven countless times was about to transform into something far darker, something beyond the realm of logic. The world around them would change, and so would they. And it all started with a young man, a boy, really, stranded in the middle of nowhere. But this wasn't just a lost traveler. No, he wasn't a wanderer of the desert. He was something far worse, and he was about to change everything. The sun hung low, casting a deep orange hue over the vast Arizona desert. The heat shimmered from the asphalt as David Blackwell gripped the steering wheel with a sense of unease that he couldn't explain. Marla sat beside him, her fingers lightly tapping against the window, her gaze lost in the endless stretch of road ahead. It was supposed to be an ordinary trip, a simple getaway to Yuma to visit David's family and tell them about their recent elopement. There was nothing to worry about, nothing, except the strange feeling that had settled over them since they left Henderson, Nevada. It was a feeling David tried to ignore, but it gnawed at him. The feeling that this journey would not be like the others. As they approached Bullhead City, the air seemed to thicken, a strange pressure weighing down on their chests. It was as if the land itself had become heavy, the weight of an unseen presence pressing in on them. And then, as if on cue, Marla broke the silence. "David, look," she whispered, her voice trembling. David's eyes followed her finger, pointing towards something up ahead, something in the middle of the road. At first, he thought it was just a mirage, a trick of the desert. But no, this was real. There, standing in the middle of the highway, was a figure. A boy, not a man, just a boy, barely 17, with disheveled hair, clothes torn and filthy, his face pale as if drained of color. "What the hell?" David muttered, his foot hovering over the brake. Marla's heart skipped a beat. Should we stop? What if he's in trouble? David hesitated. In the middle of nowhere, on a desolate stretch of highway, who would leave a teenager stranded out here? But something about the boy, standing so still, made David uneasy. He wasn't moving. He wasn't even blinking. The car slowly came to a stop beside him. The boy didn't flinch, didn't look at them, didn't acknowledge their presence at all. David rolled down the window, trying to steady his nerves. "Hey, are you okay?" David's voice was firm, but with an edge of uncertainty. The boy didn't speak. He just stared straight ahead, his dark eyes empty and lifeless, like those of someone who had seen too much of the world's horrors to be human anymore. Marla opened the door, stepping out cautiously. "We need to help him, David. He's just a kid." Reluctantly, David followed her. They tried to talk to him, but the boy remained silent, his eyes vacant as though his mind was elsewhere. After several long moments of trying to engage him, David made a decision. "We're taking him to the nearest police station. He needs help." They forced the boy into the back seat of the car. He didn't resist, didn't even acknowledge that he was being moved. The whole situation felt wrong, like a bad omen hovering over them. But they didn't have a choice. As they continued down the road, the tension in the car only grew. The silence felt suffocating. David kept glancing at the boy in the rear-view mirror. There was something about him, something off. His eyes didn't move, didn't blink, didn't follow the passing scenery. He was like a ghost. And then it happened. Marla, looking out the window, felt a strange, gnawing sensation in her stomach. It was as if the world around them was shifting, warping. She blinked, trying to shake off the feeling, but the air felt thick, as if the desert itself had suddenly become alive, watching them. David was silent, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, but his grip on the steering wheel tightened. He felt it too. The air around them seemed to press in on them from all sides, squeezing the life out of the car. Suddenly, without warning, The boy spoke. His voice was barely a whisper, but it sent chills crawling up their spines. "What state am I in?" he asked, his words strange, almost detached. David and Marla exchanged a quick, confused glance. "What do you mean?" "You're in Arizona," David replied, trying to sound calm, though his heart raced in his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The boy didn't seem to hear him, or maybe he just didn't care. His eyes, still unfocused, drifted toward the window as if lost in a world of his own. "No, I'm supposed to be in Arkansas," the boy murmured, almost as if he was speaking to himself. That was when David's heart dropped. His breath caught in his throat. Arkansas? How could he? But before either of them could say anything, the air in the car seemed to change again. The pressure around them grew heavier, thicker, as if they were no longer just driving down a road in Arizona. Something was twisting, bending. Time itself felt like it was warping, pulling them somewhere they shouldn't be. As they neared the outskirts of Bullhead City, the car's headlights illuminated a strange bend in the road, one that hadn't been there moments ago. David's heart pounded in his chest as the car suddenly veered to the right. He yanked the wheel, but it was too late. The world seemed to slow, stretching out like a nightmare. The tires screamed against the asphalt as they plummeted down a steep incline, the car crashing into a large rock before coming to a halt. Everything went still. The air was dead. The silence was suffocating. Marla's heart hammered in her chest. She looked around in confusion. This wasn't right. She knew this road. This stretch of Highway 95 was supposed to be straight. So straight you could see for miles. But now it curved into darkness, and she had no idea where they were. "David, what just happened?" Her voice was hoarse, as if the words had to fight their way out. David was pale. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. I don't know. This isn't the road. It shouldn't be here." They both climbed out of the car. But even as they stood on the soft, uneven dirt of the hill they had crashed down, something felt wrong. The landscape had changed. The mountains in the distance weren't familiar, and the desert itself felt different. The plants were all wrong. The air tasted foreign. David looked at her, his voice cracking. "Mara, we're not in Arizona anymore, are we?" She didn't know how to respond. She felt it too, the shift, the change. It was as though they had slipped through some kind of invisible rift into another world. But they had no answers, only questions. And then they saw it. In the distance, about 50 yards away, a green and white camping trailer sat, oddly out of place. "Let's go check it out. Maybe someone's there," David said, his voice now laced with fear. He grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the trailer. But as they walked, a chilling thought ran through Marla's mind. If we find someone there, who will they be? David and Marla's footsteps were soft against the dry earth, but to them, every sound felt amplified. The night air, now colder than before, seemed to wrap around them like an unseen hand. The eerie silence of the desert was broken only by the distant hum of insects, yet even that felt wrong, distorted, like it was part of a dream they could not escape from. David tugged at Marla's hand, his grip tighter than before. "We need to keep moving," he muttered, his voice strained. "Something doesn't feel right." Marla's heart was in her throat, her breathing shallow. She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't supposed to be here. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, watching them. Each step they took seemed to pull them deeper into a nightmare, and yet they couldn't stop now. They had to find answers. Answers to the boy, to the road that had never existed, to the twisted reality they had fallen into. The trailer stood there, untouched, yet oddly wrong. Its green and white exterior glowed in the dim light of the car's headlights, but it wasn't the glow of warmth. It was cold, unnatural, like the light itself was trying to warn them. David hesitated before stepping up to the door. The rusted metal handle looked old, worn, as if it had been waiting for someone for years. But who? And why did it feel like it was waiting for them? "Do you hear that?" Marla's voice trembled as she stood a few feet behind him. her eyes scanning the area around them. David stopped, his hand on the door. He looked at her, a cold chill creeping up his spine. "What do you mean?" It's like someone is whispering," she whispered back, her voice barely audible. "Can't you hear it?" David stood still, listening. At first, he heard nothing, just the wind, the distant hum of the insects, and the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. But then, faintly, from inside the trailer, there it was, a whisper, barely a breath of sound, but it was there. "Help me! Help me!" The voice was weak, strained, like it was coming from someone who had been trapped for too long. Without thinking, David pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, a sound that seemed to echo into the emptiness, making the hairs on his neck stand up. He stepped inside, Marla right behind him. The interior was dimly lit, but not by any light they could see. The air felt heavy, thick with the scent of dust, old wood, and something else, something metallic, like the scent of blood. The trailer was small, cramped, with peeling wallpaper and broken furniture scattered around. The floor was covered in dirt and grime, and the air had a stale, suffocating quality to it. But the strangest thing was a feeling, the sensation that they were not alone. Marla could feel it too, something in the pit of her stomach that told her this place was wrong, that it had been wrong for a long time. David reached for the light switch, but when he flipped it, nothing happened. The room remained in darkness, except for the faint glow coming from somewhere deeper inside. His hand trembled as he turned back to Marla, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to leave. Now." But as he turned to leave, something stopped him, a faint sound, like the rustling of paper or cloth. He spun around, his heart racing. From the far corner of the trailer, a figure emerged. It wasn't the boy from the road. It wasn't a person at all. The figure was humanoid but distorted, twisted. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its face, if you could even call it that, was a blur of features constantly shifting, as though it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Its eyes were the most horrifying part, black pits, empty and endless, sucking in all light around them. "Who are you?" David's voice cracked. His legs felt like they were made of stone, unable to move. The thing didn't respond. It simply stood there, watching them, its mouth opening wide, too wide. And then it spoke, its voice a garbled, inhuman screech that made the walls of the trailer seem to shake. "You shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have come to the Parabola." David's blood ran cold. The Parabola, the figure leaned closer, its mouth stretching impossibly wide, as if it were about to swallow them whole. "You are here. You are part of it now," the voice hissed. "You've crossed the line. You've entered the place where time and space don't matter. You've seen what should not be seen." Marla screamed, pulling at David's arm. "We have to get out of here, now!" But the figure was already moving, its twisted form floating toward them with unnatural speed. The air seemed to thicken as it approached, the temperature dropping, the shadows growing darker and darker. David yanked Marla toward the door, but as they ran, the trailer seemed to elongate, stretching out in front of them. It was as if the world itself had shifted, warping into a space where nothing was familiar. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, trapping them inside. David's mind raced, panic setting in. What's happening? What is this place? He tried to pull the door open, but it wouldn't budge. The metal handle felt cold, almost alive in his hand. The air was suffocating now, thick with a presence that pressed down on them, crushing them with every breath. The walls of the trailer seemed to pulse, like the heartbeat of something ancient, something that had been waiting for them. Behind them, the figure's distorted voice echoed once more. "You'll never leave. Once you enter, you belong to the Parabola." David's heart skipped a beat. The Parabola? The name echoed in his mind, like a whisper from the past. What did it mean? How had they ended up here? As the trailer seemed to close in on them, Marla grabbed David's arm, her face pale with fear. "David, we need to find a way out." But no matter where they looked, The door was locked, the windows sealed shut. The trailer was alive, and they were its prisoners. And somewhere in the distance, the low whisper of the boy's voice called to them, "Help me! You should have helped me." The air in the trailer felt thick, as if it were alive and breathing. Each breath they took seemed to fill their lungs with something foul, something unnatural. The walls, once just peeling wallpaper and old furniture, now seemed to pulse with an eerie, sickly rhythm, like the heartbeat of a giant, ancient creature. David tried the door again, his hands shaking as they gripped the cold metal. The door wouldn't budge. It was as if it had become part of the trailer itself, locked by something far beyond his understanding. He turned to Marla, panic in his eyes. "We need to get out now," he gasped, his voice cracking. But Marla wasn't looking at him. She was staring at something. No. Someone across the room. David's eyes followed her gaze, and his heart stopped. The figure that had once been standing behind them was now in the center of the room, its body floating, its feet never touching the ground. Its mouth opened again, too wide, too grotesque, as it spoke with that same garbled, screeching voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "You should have left when you had the chance. You crossed the threshold. You're here now." David's skin crawled. "What is this place?" he shouted, his voice desperate. "What do you want from us?" The figure tilted its head, its face contorting into something that could have been a smile, if it were even human. "We want nothing from you," it whispered, "but for you to join us in the Parabola. This is where things come to rest, where the lost are found." David turned to Marla, his eyes wide with fear. "Marla, we have to leave. We have to get out of here." His voice broke, a sob escaping him. But Marla was frozen, her face pale, her body trembling. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure. And then it spoke again, its voice a slithering hiss that seemed to crawl into their ears and make their minds ache. "Don't look away. Don't turn your back. This place, it takes what it wants. It doesn't let you go." The room grew colder, the temperature dropping so suddenly that Marla's breath fogged in front of her. It wasn't just cold. It was the kind of cold that settled deep in your bones, the kind that made you feel as though something ancient was watching you, waiting for you to make a mistake. David grabbed her arm, his grip tight as he tried to pull her towards the door again. "We can't stay here. We have to find a way out." But as he moved towards the door, the trailer shifted again. The walls twisted. The floor seemed to bend under their feet, and the very air around them seemed to warp. The door, once a solid barrier, now seemed to lead to nowhere, a black void beyond the threshold that stretched into an endless, dark abyss. "No, no, no!" David screamed, pulling back from the door, his mind racing. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be happening. Marla, still trembling, turned her gaze toward the window. It was cracked, a thin sliver of moonlight cutting through the darkness. But even that was fading. Outside, the desert had changed too. The road that had once been straight and endless was now a winding maze, twisting in impossible shapes that defied the laws of physics. And then came the whisper, the same whisper they had heard before, the same one they had heard from the boy. "Help me, help me." David's heart raced. That voice, it's him. The boy, he's here. But Marla wasn't listening. Her gaze had fixed on something in the corner of the trailer, something so faint that it was almost invisible. Yet it felt like the air around it was vibrating with energy, slowly, like she was being drawn to it. Marla began to move toward the corner, her steps hesitant but inevitable. "Marla, no!" David shouted, but it was too late. She was already there, standing in front of a darkened doorway that had never been there before. It was as if the trailer had given birth to it in an instant, a door that led deeper into the blackness, beyond the walls of the trailer, into something even darker. The voice came again, softer this time, but full of terror. "It's not over. Not yet. It has only just begun." Marla's hand reached for the doorknob, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. But David yanked her back. "No!" he shouted, dragging her away. "We don't know what's on the other side. Don't open it." But Marla, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and something else, curiosity or maybe desperation, looked at him. "I don't think we have a choice. We have to go in." David's heart pounded in his chest as he struggled to hold her back, but Marla was stronger than she had ever been before. She pulled herself free from his grasp and threw open the door, and what they saw beyond it was enough to make David's blood run cold. A vast, endless abyss stretched before them, an ocean of dark, swirling mist that moved with an unnatural, almost sentient will. There were no stars, no moon, no sign of anything familiar, just darkness. And in that darkness, something was moving toward them, something alive. David's breath caught in his throat. "What is that? What is that thing?" But Marla, her face a mask of terror, couldn't answer. The thing, it was closer now, its shape taking form, but it wasn't a shape at all. It was a mass of writhing shadows, shifting and twisting, a thing that had no real form, no solid structure. But as it came closer, David could feel its presence, its cold, suffocating presence, pressing in on him from all sides. Marla screamed, but it was too late. The thing was upon them. The thing in the doorway was no longer a shapeless mass of shadows. It was solidifying before their eyes, taking on an eerie form, something almost human but distorted. Its body twisted at impossible angles, limbs too long, fingers too thin, and its skin slick and black like the surface of an oil-slicked ocean. Its face, if you could call it that, was a jagged mask of hollow, empty eyes, and a gaping mouth that stretched unnaturally wide, filled with rows upon rows of teeth, sharp like broken glass. Marla's scream echoed through the trailer, but it was swallowed whole by the thing in the doorway. David felt his stomach turn as it took a slow, deliberate step forward. He couldn't breathe. It was like his body had forgotten how to function, his feet glued to the floor, his mind screaming at him to run, to do something, anything, but his limbs refused to obey. The thing's eyes, if you could even call them eyes, shifted slowly toward Marla, and it smiled. That smile, it wasn't a smile of joy or amusement, but a grin of hunger, a grin that made David's blood run cold. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a deafening drum in his ears. He wanted to shout, to tell Marla to run, but he couldn't form the words. I think it wants us," Marla whispered, her voice trembling. She stepped forward, almost as if drawn to it, her legs moving without her control. It was as if the very air around her had a pull, dragging her closer, pulling her toward the nightmare standing in front of them. David tried to move, tried to pull her back, but his body wouldn't obey him. He could only watch as she stepped closer to the creature. "You don't belong here," the thing hissed, its voice distorted, as if multiple voices were speaking at once, all fighting to be heard. "This place, this world, it's not your world anymore. You've crossed the line, David." "Marla, welcome to the Parabola." David's stomach dropped. The word parabola echoed in his mind like a thunderclap. That word, that had been what Jace Kelly had spoken about, what the voice in the darkness had whispered to them, but they had never understood its true meaning until now. Marla took another step forward. Her expression had changed. Her fear, that initial terror that had clouded her every thought, seemed to be fading. It was as if something else, something darker, was taking root inside her. Her eyes, once wide with fear, now had a cold, detached gleam in them, a distant look that made David's blood run even colder. She wasn't herself anymore. "No!" David shouted, his voice hoarse as he rushed forward, grabbing her arm, trying to pull her back. But his grip slipped. It was as though her body had turned to stone, no longer pliable, no longer her own. Her face turned slowly to him, but her eyes no longer recognized him. "Marla, don't do this. Please, don't let it take you." But it was too late. The thing in the doorway reached out a long, skeletal hand. And the moment it touched Marla's arm, her body jerked violently. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, and her entire frame shook with an unnatural force. The air around them began to hum, vibrating with a terrible energy. The walls of the trailer seemed to close in around them, warping, stretching, and twisting, as though reality itself was bending, as if they were no longer even on Earth. David was screaming, shaking her, trying to pull her away, but it was as though he was fighting against a tidal wave of pure, suffocating fear. The darkness that had once been confined to the trailer now spread across everything. Darkness so deep that it swallowed everything whole. The windows shattered, the roof cracked, and a low, guttural sound, like the growl of some ancient beast, filled the air. And then, as quickly as it had all started, the trailer was gone. The Parabola had claimed them. David and Marla were no longer in the trailer, no longer in the world they had known. They were standing in an endless desert. The horizon stretched forever, and the sky above them was a sickly greenish black, swirling with unnatural storm clouds that churned like a vortex. The ground beneath their feet was cracked, dry, and brittle, as though it hadn't seen water in centuries. David turned to look at Marla. She was standing there, her expression blank, her eyes wide and empty. She wasn't there anymore. Not really. Something in her had broken, shattered by whatever had taken place in the Parabola. The creature, no, the thing, was standing behind them now, its form shifting with every blink of the eye. Its voice echoed in their minds, cold and indifferent. "You are mine now." David's legs gave out, and he sank to the ground, feeling the weight of despair pressing in from all sides. There was no escape, no way out. The Parabola had claimed them, and there was no going back. The terror that started with a seemingly innocent encounter has now spiraled into something far worse. The Parabola, an unexplainable rift between worlds, has claimed David and Marla, and they have become part of something much darker, much older than they could ever comprehend. If you found yourself gripping your seat, feeling your heart race as the darkness closed in on David and Marla, then make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next part of the spine-chilling journey. Like this video if you want more terrifying tales, and leave a comment below to share your thoughts. Do you think there's any way out for David and Marla? Or is this their final resting place in the Parabola? Let us know and be part of the conversation. Stay tuned for the next chapter, where the horrors will only escalate, and the truth about the Parabola will begin to unravel if they survive long enough to escape.